Hi, I'm Jill Wiseman. We're going to be working today on the Sleek Bracelet, which is a really great beginner bracelet project. You're going to actually learn 2 stitches with this bracelet. We're going to do the base of the bracelet with square stitch, which is a really nice sturdy project. And then we're going to also cover peyote stitch a little bit with the toggle end here. So let's talk a little bit about seed beads. Seed beads are made out of glass. They've been around for thousands and thousands of years. The ones that we're using today are mostly made in Japan. There's also a very big seed bead industry in the Czech Republic. You've also seen them come out of China too, but the Japanese beads are my favorite. The ones that we're going to be working with today are specifically delicas. And the reason we're working with these delicas is because they're cylinder-shaped beads instead of rounded seed beads. It allows us to have a really defined edge here. If we use the round beads, it would be a little more wavy, not quite as precise. And that's why I've chosen the delicas for us to work with today. Remember that seed beads are really small, but I will tell you that the delica holes are quite large, so you're not going to have nearly as much trouble as you might think you're going to. But set yourself up for success and be in a place where you have really good lighting. If you're wearing glasses, make sure you're wearing those. If you need additional magnification, you can find those items also. We want to make sure that you have fun while you're doing this. I love beginners because I love to get you all involved in seed bead work, and so I can't wait to get started. Here are the tools that you need for the project. You're going to need some kind of beading surface. This happens to be a piece of felt. You can also use a piece of Velux blanket that you can cut out, or even a kitchen towel will work. You basically just want some kind of surface that your beads aren't going to roll around on you. You're going to need a tape measure to measure your wrist and then also to measure your project while you're working on it. Some kind of scissors. I tend to like these small little scissors because they cut really well and they're inexpensive when they wear out. Any kind of little small scissors will work for you. Needles are very important in what we do, and I suggest using size 12 needles for this project. They're a little bit thinner, and that means that the eye on them is a little bit thinner, so it's a little bit harder to thread your needle. But the payoff is, as you're going through these beads, it's not going to get hung up so much as the beads fill up with thread. You could also use a size 10 needle, which is a little bit bigger, but you probably will then have to use these a little bit more, which is some flat nose pliers that you will grab onto your needle if you're having trouble getting it through the bead and pull on through. The beads that you need for this project are approximately 3.5 grams of delicas. These are cylinder beads and we're using size 11. The 3.5 grams is for the outside outline color of your bracelet. We're also using delicas for the inside main color of your bracelet, and you will need about 7 grams of these. The bugle beads are used on the outside edges. With this project, I like to use 2 specific kinds of thread. I like to use a Nymo thread or a Ceylon in size D. The thread works really well, but a lot of people have moved away from thread in recent years, and so my very first choice actually is using Fireline. I use the 6-pound size, and Fireline comes in several different colors. The 2 that I use most are the crystal and the smoke. The smoke kind of disappears into the background. The crystal has a little bit of a white cast to it, and that's good for beads that maybe you can see through. The white won't show up as much in the inside of the bead. So now we're going to start by cutting our thread, and we're going to start out with a shorter length than you might work up to later. I like to do about an arm's length, which works out to roughly a yard or so. And I hold some tension on the thread as I cut it and just nip it off there. Once you have your thread cut, you're going to want to thread your needle with it. If you're using the fire line like I like to use, it has a bit of some body to it. So you're going to want to take your fingernails and rub it against the outside edge here and kind of flatten it down so that you'll be able to get that tip through the eye of the needle. The shorter you keep this little section in between your fingers as you're going up to the needle, the easier it is to thread your needle. Another tip that works for some people is think of taking your needle to the thread instead of your thread to the needle. Once you get that needle threaded, you're going to pull it down, pull your thread and double it over. We'll only be working with a single length of thread, but by doubling it over, it won't be quite as long, and you can adjust that as you need to. We also want, in this project, to add a stopper bead or some stopper beads. It's a way of keeping your beads from falling off the end of your thread while you're starting your stitching. So in this case, I'm using 3 of my delicas. I put them on my needle. I'll bring them down until I have about a 4 to 6 inch tail below there. We're just going to need enough that we can weave that in later. And from that tail end, I'm going to go back up through all those beads, all 3 of them. Your thread is going to show on the outside of these beads. You can kind of see that little loop of thread underneath there. That's totally fine for us to have that there. We are using these as a temporary measure only, and we're going to take them off once we have our stitching going. So here we have the 3 beads that I put on for a stopper bead. I used the inside color because this first section that we're going to be working on, we're using the outline color, and I didn't want to accidentally bead these into the piece. So I used the opposite color so I knew not to bead them in. These are just going to help keep us from having our beads fall off the end. The first step is to pick up 13 delicas. Now we have the 13 delicas strung on, and I brought them down to that stopper bead, and you can see how that stopper bead is keeping them from falling off the end. We'll make our first square stitch. I like to hold this so that the tail and the stopper bead is up, away from my body. This 13th bead is actually the first bead of your second row. I'm going to attach this bead to the second to last bead, and to do that, we're going to get them to sit where we want them to. We're going to go from the top, meaning the tail end of this second bead, all the way through, and pull your needle. So I've come through this bead, and now I need to get to the top of the new bead that I just added so that I'm in position to add another bead. I find that if I put my finger over this intersection where I'm pulling, it keeps the beads in place and helps keep everything from pulling too wildly out of reach. And now you have those 2 beads sitting nicely side by side. We'll pick up our next bead. We want this bead to sit right next to the next bead in this row. So we're going to go again from the top or the tail end of that bead through the bead. You can pinch over it to help keep everything aligned. And then I need to go up through the bead that I just added to secure it. Now you're going to feel kind of fumbly fingered through this. The very first part of any seed bead project is your hardest because you don't have a whole lot to hold on to. But just keep with it and you'll be doing good. We're going to keep adding 1 bead at a time until we have added a bead and attached one to every single one of these initial row beads. So it's picking up a brand new delica. Needling through the bead you want it to sit next to. Put your finger over it while you're pulling your thread. And then up through the bead you just added. So you're making a complete circle around those beads. One thing to watch for is as you're pulling this thread through, look to make sure that you're not catching any loops of thread on any of these other beads. That thread is going to sit right along the intersection between the beads here. So look for that and make sure that that's popping into place. Now we have all 12 beads attached. So we've got 24 beads in sets of 2. You'll notice that there's kind of a C curve to this, and it's kind of going to be loosey-goosey. One of the things that we do with square stitch is after we've added every row, we go back and reinforce the previous row plus the row that we just added. So that's what we're about to do now. I find it easier to do if I'm working from me outwards. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip this over. Now the thread that my working thread is coming out the bottom, and I take this needle and I'm going to go up through, I'm not adding any beads, I'm just literally just taking that needle and thread and going through all of those beads in that previous row. The one thing you want to double check while you're doing this is I will oftentimes flip to the back and make sure that my needle is not showing anywhere. You want to make sure your needle has gone through all the beads and not skipped a bead, and that way you would end up having thread showing. So now that I know that I've got all the beads, or the needle through all the beads, we're going to pull that through. We're going to flip it again. And now we're going to go through all the beads in the row that we just added. This makes square stitch one of the strongest stitches in the bead weaving stitches. There we go. I like to work always from the bottom up, so I'm going to flip it back again. So don't ever be afraid to flip it. And then we're going to be ready to start our third row. For the next row, we're going to start out using one of our outside color beads, or that outline color. Do a regular square stitch like we've been doing. Now you're already going to find a difference in how you hold this because you've got a little more to hold on to. Back up through the bead you just added. And then here's where we get to add our first bugle bead. Your bugle bead is the same size as 2 of these size 11 delicas put together. So when we put this bugle bead on, we're going to put it over 2 of these delicas, which means we're going to skip 1 delica and needle now through the second delica up. And you're going through both of those because that bugle bead is going to sit right next to, get all this thread out of the way for you, right next to those 2 delicas. As we pull down, the bugle bead can sometimes be a little ornery and he doesn't want to sit right. That one flipped over pretty good, but sometimes you have to use your finger and kind of coax him into position there. And then just like it was a regular delica bead, you're going to needle up through that bugle bead. You can see how he sits right in that intersection there. We're going to pick up one more outline color and attach that. And now here's the best part of that bracelet. We get to cheat now. We're going to start picking up our inside color, that main color that you're going to be adding in. And we're going to start out by picking up 4 of those, of the main color. But we're not going to stitch in each one of these main colors. We're going to let them sit loose. And that's how we're cheating. We're going to get a whole bunch of beads added in here. They're nice and loose, and it gives the bracelet a very fluid kind of motion. We also need to then pick up one of our outline color bead, because that is the bead that we're going to actually attach. So we've got the 4 inside color and the 1 outside color. We're going to skip 4 beads, 2, 3, 4, and go in through the 5th bead. So we're needling into that 5th bead. You see how these inside color beads are all loose. You can see that there is space in here. So they're not attached. We only attached this top bead, which is that outline color. We're going to add 1 more bugle bead right here for that outside edge. Again, it's going to go over 2 beads. So we're needling through 2 beads there. And then back up through that bugle bead. Our last bead of this row is that outside color. Back up through. And there we go. Again, we're going to need to reinforce, so I will flip it so that everything's coming out the bottom. I'm going to go through all the beads of the previous row. This is an example of where my needle actually poked through the beads. You can see that the needle is showing, which means that my thread would be showing. So I need to be real careful as I'm reinforcing that it's actually going through the beads. You don't have to do this all in one step. You could actually go through 4 beads, pull it, go through 4 beads, whatever's most comfortable for you. So we went through all those beads of that previous row. I'm going to flip it again so that I can go through all the beads of the row that I just added. Do all that extra reinforcement, flip it, and now I'm ready to add the next row. You're going to be adding 3 rows total that have 4 of these delicas across. Once you've added 3 rows that have 4 delicas, your next 3 rows are going to have 5 delicas across. There's going to be a little bit of adjustment. You want to kind of use a soft tension. You don't want to pull super tight when you're doing that, because we're going to be gradually making this flare out so that we can get a nice soft flare there. One of the things that I like to do when I'm adding an extra delica row in, do a little wiggle. Just take the whole thing, wiggle it a little bit. It helps make space in there for that extra bead to sit in comfortably. Next bead is going to be a bugle bead. That one popped in nicely. One more outside outline color. Four of your inside color plus 1 of your outline color, because that's the one we're going to stitch in. a bugle bead to match our bugle bead. Back up through, and then one more outside color. As always, don't forget to do your reinforcement. And let me show you a tip. Sometimes when you're doing all this reinforcing, your needle can get really stuck in here because you're filling up all the inside of those holes with thread. So if you're having trouble pulling that needle through, you can use a flat nose pliers of some sort, and just grab the tip of that needle, and that's going to give you enough force to pull it through with no problem. We'll flip it, reinforce the row that we just added. Bring our thread down to the bottom, and we're ready to start the very next row. Now we have our 3 rows where we've put 4 of that inside color across. We're ready for our first row where we're going to have 5 of that color. We'll pick up 5 of that inside color Delica, and then just like before, you'll still have to pick up 1 of the outline color because that's what we're going to stitch in. You'll notice how this is kind of curved. It doesn't fit as nicely as it did before. It's because we've got a whole extra bead in there. We're still going to force it in. We're going to go through your outside color bead and see how that kind of pulls it in. There's a little bit of extra bow to it. You're going to find that by the time you've added the next 2 rows with 5 beads in the center there, it's going to all even out quite a bit. And this is where you can do a little bit of wiggling and just kind of wiggle the beads, and I'm pulling apart a little bit to kind of help let all of these beads find their natural location there. We'll finish out the row by adding a bugle bead, and then your last outside color Delica. We'll need to reinforce those rows. So the previous row first. And then the row we just added. Now this, because they're all wonky, you may have to do it in more than one pull. So there I just pulled through a couple of the beads. And now I'm going to go catch the rest. We're going to make those beads behave. And there we go. A little more wiggle. And now we're ready to start our next row. So we'll do 2 more rows with 5 Delicas. At that point, we'll switch over and start putting 6 Delicas in the center. And we'll do 3 rows with 6 Delicas. You're going to keep increasing every 3 rows, adding a Delica until you've got an entire row with 13 Delicas across the center. At that point, we're going to start doing the middle section, which will stay 14 Delicas for quite a while. You may be wondering about when it's going to be time to add thread. And my answer to that is don't wait until you've got a little tiny stub of thread left. You need enough so that you can weave back and forth with it a little bit. Adding and ending thread is nobody's favorite part of this, but it is an essential part. So here I've got enough that I could probably eke out one more row, but I'm not gonna push it. So what I'm gonna do is end this thread right now. Because with square stitch we've done so much going around in circles, we're reversing directions with that thread a whole bunch of times, which makes it really unlikely that the thread is ever gonna pull out. We're just going to make sure one more time by going back and forth through the beads a couple of times, remembering to reverse direction each time, and then we'll be able to cut off the extra. So what I like to do is you want to make sure that you keep that thread along a thread intersection that already exists. For instance, you wouldn't want to pop up to the bugle bead, because if you did, your thread would show on the outside of the beads. So I just like to go through these outside 3 beads, the delica, the bugle, and the outside colored delica. I'm just going to needle through those 3 beads one direction. Then I'm going to move to the next row, and I'm going back through the next row, these outside 3 beads, and pulling. And then at that point I know that I've reversed enough times, I can actually go in and clip that thread, and I just try to hold some tension on the thread and clip it as close to the beads as possible, and that just comes on off. We could go ahead and just take those stopper beads off at this point. Sometimes they'll just pull right off. I'm just putting my finger over them and pulling them along the thread. If that doesn't work, you can back this out, and all I'm doing is taking the tail end and passing it back through those beads, and then those beads will be loose and we can just take them off. No need for stoppers anymore. To add a new thread, you're just going to do the same back and forth weaving that you did before. You're just going to start back a couple of rows. So in this case, I'll start back 3 rows, go up through a couple of beads, and pull. I want to leave a little bit of a tail here, just enough for me to hold on to, so that as I make the rest of my stitches, I'm not pulling that thread through those beads and undoing what I just did. So I put that under my thumb on top of the beads. Then I'm going to reverse directions with my thread. Go through those outside 3 beads. Go back up through this very first bead here. And now we're ready to add our very first bead of the next row. This is our first row of adding 14 beads across the middle. So we'll pick up that first outside color delica. Our bugle bead. One more of your outside color. Stitch that into place. And then 14 of your inside color plus 1 of your outside color. We stitch only the outside color. This is what can happen when you're pulling your thread through. You can get a tangle here at the back. Don't try to pull that through your beads, because what's going to happen is it's going to knot. Take a moment, smooth this out, and then pull on through. We'll stitch that last outside color bead together. Then we're ready for a bugle. And your last outside color bead. Like always, you're going to do your reinforcing. And because at this point that inside row, those inside rows are so long, you may just want to go ahead and assume that you're going to have to do part of the row, needle through, go back and catch the rest of those beads in that row. Don't drive yourself crazy trying to do it in one motion. It's not worth it. And then back through the row we just added. Here I am trying to make sure that I'm catching all the beads and not letting my needle show. And actually you can see that the beads have popped above the needle. So we're just going to pull back the needle and reinsert it and catch all of those beads. We're just going to catch those couple of beads, a couple more beads, and then we should be able to finish out the row. There we go. So you're going to keep adding rows of 14 beads across the center until you've created the length that you want. Let's talk for a second about how you're going to determine the length of your bracelet. This is a finished piece that includes your clasp. It measures roughly 7.5 inches. I like to wear this bracelet so that it's a little bit on the loose side, and so what I do is take your tape measure and measure around your wrist. If you have a 6-inch wrist, you'll want to add an inch to that measurement and make a 7-inch bracelet. In this case, since it's a 7.5-inch length, this would be perfect for somebody with a wrist of 6.5 inches. How that translates into the actual beads is this section here shows you all of the increase section up to 13 delicas across the inside. This runs 2 1/4 inch. This is a finite number because you're always going to be doing 3 rows of each number of bead across, so this will always be 2 1/4. You're going to have the same thing over here on your decrease end. You start your decrease at 13 across the center and go down just exactly the way you did at the beginning. So this will also be 2 1/4 inches long. Your clasp will add 1 inch. When you add 2 1/4 and 2 1/4 plus 1 inch, that gives you 5.5 inches. That means any of the adjustment of size is going to be done in the center section with the 14 delicas across. You could make this section a 1/2 inch if you wanted to, or 3 inches if you needed to. That's where all that adjustment in size is going to be. When you make this bracelet, you're actually going to be making it all in one piece. I just happen to have these 3 pieces because it was a little easier for me to show you how the whole thing is put together. I've determined my length, and I know I need 1 more row of 14 of those inside delica colors across, so we're going to add that very last row before we start our decrease. Pick up our bugle. More inside color. Sorry, actually that's an outside color. and then 14 across for the last time. Okay, we'll stitch in that outside color. Another bugle bead. And one last outside color bead. One thing I want to notice or point out to you, see how crazy curved my needle has gotten? That's normal. Don't worry about that. The pressure of your fingers on your needle will make it curve, especially if you're using a size 12 needle. So don't worry about that and try to unbend it. You won't be able to do it. So we need to reinforce those last two rows. Let's see here. And then the very last row. You'll notice that one of the things that I do as I'm reinforcing this row, or really making any stitch, is I take my hand and pull that thread taut. It helps keep the thread out of the way. I've got it all held in my other hand, and that way I can get my needle in smoothly into the beads. I felt it hook. I felt it when I went to go pull it through. I felt it stop a little short, so I knew that I had a little loop that had hooked on the end part of my bracelet here. So I went to go find that, otherwise that loop of thread would show. We'll flip it over, and now we're ready for the decrease section. Now that we've finished the center section with our 14 beads across, we're going to start that decrease. And that means everything's going to be the same, but when we get to the center section here, we're only going to add 13 beads. So we'll add our very first outside color bead. Now you might think when you're adding or when you're starting that decrease that you have to pull a whole lot tighter. The answer is you have to pull just a little bit tighter with your tension, but you don't have to go crazy with it. And you'll even find yourself with a little bit of thread showing, and that's okay, because as you keep going with the decrease, that thread kind of gets sucked up. It's kind of like seed bead magic. Add this last of the outside section here. Now we're going to pick up those 13 inside color delicas. And then I also added in that one outside color delica that we will actually stitch in. You'll notice as I attach these that this row kind of is sitting back behind the previous row instead of right next to it like it has before. That's okay. It's a little bit shorter than that previous row. It's going to want to kind of hide a little bit. You're just going to use your finger and poke it forward and go through your outside color bead like normal. This is where people kind of go crazy with pulling on tension, but you'll notice that all I did was do a slight little tug and it pulled in nicely and smoothly. You're going to pick up your next bugle bead, attach that, and then your last outside color bead. Still reinforcing those rows. Flip it over and then reinforce that brand new row you added. And then you're ready to do your next row of 13 across. So you're going to reverse what you did as you were increasing. You're just going to do your 3 rows of 13, and then you'll do 3 rows of 12 in the center, 3 rows of 11, and so forth until you get back down to where you've done 3 rows with 4 beads in the center. Here we've finished all of our decrease rows. We ended with 4 across on the end, 3 rows of 4 across. So now we're going to have to go back and remember how at the beginning we've got these 2 rows that are all the delicas, that outline color delica? Well, we need to repeat that over here so we're symmetrical. Here's how we're going to do that. Your very first stitch is going to be just like every other stitch, with a single square stitch. Here we run into the fact that we're going to have to put 2 delicas here in the place of the 1 bugle bead. So you're picking up 2 of those outside colored delicas and going through the bugle bead This is one of those cases where it's getting really tight in there, and I'm going to use my flat nose pliers to help me get through that bead. And just that extra little bit of push is all I need. And then we'll actually needle up through both those delicas that we just added, instead of one at a time. We'll connect the very next outside color delica. And here, if we actually square stitched a single outside color delica to each one of these inside color ones, it wouldn't match the other side. So what we're going to do is we're going to, for this is the only row we're going to do this, we're going to pick up 5 of the outside colors, and we're only stitching that 5th color. So basically we're creating that same row, but just all with one color instead of the inside colors. Here we come to another bugle bead, so we'll pick up 2 of that outside color and match it up with the bugle bead. And back through both of those 2. last outside color here. Okay, so there we have now converted this to all outside color. You would then go through and reinforce those 2 rows. I'm actually going to not do that right this second because those beads are all full with thread. I've filled them up successfully. You won't have that problem at home. But then we're going to flip it over, and now this time we're going to square stitch a single outside color bead to every single one of these delicas. I'm down to the last 2 of these outside color seed beads to, delicas to attach. And then this is going to end off our main segment of the bracelet. After this, we're going to switch over and do something totally unconnected to this. We still have to do our reinforcement rows. Don't forget those. Easier from the bottom. We're going to switch over and do the peyote tube toggle. If you have a length of thread that is long enough, go ahead and keep it attached and not end it off into your bracelet. We're switching over to peyote stitch now to create a little peyote tube toggle. Here you're going to notice that I have put on 3 beads as a stopper bead like I did at the beginning of the bracelet. That's just temporary to keep your beads from falling off. And I've strung 10 of our outside color delicas. So now I'm going to pick up 1 more outside color delica on my needle. Again, like I did at the beginning of the bracelet, I like to have the tail up away from my body and work in that direction. So now I've got a seed bead on my needle here, as you'll see, and I'm going to skip number 10 here and go back through number 9. Putting my finger over those beads to hold them in place while I pull. And you'll notice that this is the brand new bead that I just added, and this is the one that was previously there. So they stack up on each other and you end up with like this little T-shape thing going on. You're going to pick up a bead. You skip a bead for this new bead to sit next to, and you go through the next bead. This is what it's going to look like as you add a bead, every other bead along this section. You end up with almost like a zigzag kind of zipper effect. So you're picking up a bead, you're skipping a bead for it to sit next to, and you're needling through the next bead. You want to pull just tight enough that they all pop into place. Pick up a bead, skip a bead, and needle in through the next one. We've got 1 more to add, so we're picking up a bead, skipping a bead, and going in through that last outside color delica. And there you have the whole zigzag effect. So now you've got what I like to call the sticky outy beads, and then you have these little recesses in between the sticky outy beads. I always like to work away from me when I'm working on this, so I'm going to flip it over. I'm going to pick up a bead that's going to sit right in that hole, and I'm going to attach it by needling through the sticky outy bead. This is why everybody likes peyote so much, because you can find that sticky outy bead so easily. You're going to pick up a bead, needle through the next sticky outy. And that is just as difficult as peyote stitch gets, as those first couple rows. You're just going to keep going, filling in the holes and needling through the sticky outies. You are going to keep adding rows this way until you have got 10 rows total. End of the row. I'm going to flip it over, and now I'm ready to start the next row. I have all 10 of my rows, and you may be asking yourself, how do I know that that's 10 rows? This is the easiest way to count rows. A lot of directions will tell you that you need to count them on the diagonal, which I find very difficult because my eyes jump around. So the easiest way is to actually count the outside 2 columns here. So I have 5 beads here on my outside column, and then 5 beads on the second to the last of the outside column. And those 5 and 5 make 10, and that's how I know I've got 10 rows. What we're going to do next is take this flat piece of peyote and turn it into what a friend of mine calls the toilet paper tube. I like to fold this like a taco. You're bringing those 2 edges together, and you're going to find that you've got sticky outy beads that offset each other on either side here, like a zigzag. So that's exactly what we're going to do, is we're going to zigzag back and forth through the sticky outy beads. You're going to pick up that first sticky outy, and then your next one is going to be on the other side. And you're going to switch back those 2 from those sides each time. Sometimes you can get lucky and put your needle on the diagonal and get 2 of them at the same time. If that's driving you crazy, go ahead and just do them one at a time. Just remember to switch back and forth from side to side with your sticky outies. Okay. And now we've created this adorable little tube. It's nice and solid because we didn't make it very thick in the center. I've gone ahead and already taken off my stopper bead, so we still have this tail thread to deal with, and we still have the working thread to deal with. One thing about these peyote tube toggles is that everything is connected except right here in between where these 2 threads are. So when I go to bury my thread and end off this thread, I just want to make sure that one or the other jumps this intersection and connects these 2 outside beads right here instead of leaving them loose. So what I like to do to end my thread off here is I just cross that intersection and go down 3 beads on a diagonal, pull nice and tight so all the thread disappears. And then we're going to go up 3 beads on the diagonal right next to it. Again, this is one of those things where if you're lucky, you can get your needle through all 3 at once. And if not, don't worry about it. Just angle your needle so you can get through 1 or 2. It starts getting nice and tight in there. My rule of thumb when I'm ending a thread is I like to change directions 3 times. So this will be my 3rd change of direction. I'll go down another 2 beads. I started having trouble getting my needle through some beads, and once I took that needle off, it's really kind of no wonder. I've got it twisted in several different directions at this point. So rather than struggle with your needle like that, go ahead and get rid of it and get yourself a nice, fresh, new, straight needle. It'll make all the difference in your stitching. I have 1 more bead that I need to bring this working thread through. And now I am ready to go ahead and clip off that thread. I'm going to go ahead and do the exact same thing with my tail thread. I'll go ahead and thread my needle on it and weave this back and forth, changing directions 3 times and ending it in this tube. Now we're going to take our tube and we're going to attach it to the end of our bracelet. We still had that thread that was left over from when we finished the bracelet, so we're going to go ahead and use that, and I've worked it so that this thread is coming out the 4th bead from one of the ends. It does not matter which end, but it's coming out that 4th delica. You're going to pick up 4 delicas, and then you're going to needle through 2 beads in the center of your peyote tube. The 2 beads are going to be on the diagonal, and you're just going to kind of eyeball where the center is. Something else about this is that some of the beads will be easier to get your needle through than others, so I just kind of go around until I find 2 beads on the diagonal in the center that my needle will go nicely through. Otherwise they can get a little bit temperamental. Okay. That gives us one leg of our attachment, and then we have the peyote tube. Now we're going to do the second leg of our attachment by picking up 4 more delicas. And we're going to needle into the 4th bead from the other edge. So, because we want this to match. And that gives us our attachment. You always want to attach this end of your bracelet, of your clasp first. We're going to create a loop on the other side, but you want to do the loop last. And the reason is, however big this toggle is, you need the loop to fit around it. So you can't create the loop and then make this to fit the loop. It's much, much easier to create this first and then make the loop fit that. My rule of thumb with the clasps is that they are the point of most wear and tear. So you're going to want to reinforce this whole pathway that we just used to attach your tube at least 2 more times. I like to have 3 passes of thread through there. Makes it nice and secure. So I'm going to just come back around. I was going this direction with my thread. I need to be coming back this direction. So what I'm going to do is use the second row as a pathway. We're going to go through 2 beads on that row, and now we can go through 2 beads on the outside row. Okay. And see how that thread just popped right down in between there. You don't have to worry about any thread showing. So now we're going to just follow that whole thread path that we just went through. So up through the 4 beads in the connection, through the 2 beads in the middle of the tube, down the 4 beads on the other side of this connection, and then back through the 4 beads in that outside edge. Okay, he only wants to go through 3 beads. That's okay. We're going to catch that 4th one in a sec here. And then you would reinforce it one more time going the opposite direction. Here we are on the loop side. I didn't have any excess thread that was hanging off this edge, so I went ahead and attached a brand new thread to create the loop with. All I did was, just like I would have attached a brand new thread when I was weaving earlier, I started here, I went up through a couple of beads, turned around, changed direction, and then worked my way up so that this thread is now coming out the 4th bead of the outside edge. So I'm going to go ahead and clip this little tail off before I forget what that's all about. Creating a loop is a little bit of an inexact science because you need the loop to be big enough to go around your end, but you don't want it to be so big that it's going to be loose and your bracelet's going to fall off. In this particular case, because we're using delicas and because we're making the peyote tube toggle a specific size, I can give you a pretty good estimate of how many beads you're going to need to pick up in this step. In this case, you're going to need to pick up 28 delicas. I've got all 28 beads on my thread now. Going back towards the bracelet, you're going to needle back through the 4th bead that you put on. We're going to create a little legs for it to stand on. And I'm pulling it all down through. And see how that all comes together? Now, if I weren't so sure about the seed bead size or exactly how big this loop needed to be, I would want to test my loop with my toggle at this point. And the way that I would do that, I put my fingernail under that loop and hold some tension on it so that it's as if it were all connected. And then at that point, I would check to make sure that that loop goes over. Well, I lost my tension. That it goes over smoothly. But that it's not ridiculously big. So in this case, it's going to be just perfect. The other thing about this to know is that your loop will tighten up a little bit when you do that reinforcing step. So if it's just a little teeniest bit loose here, you're going to be okay. And you don't need to take out any beads. At this point, I know the loop is the right size. So to finish the other attachment to the bracelet, I'm going to pick up 3 more beads. And just like I did on the other side, I'm going to needle through the outside 4 beads. And tighten that all up. Same thing as on the other end, you're going to want to reinforce this entire path at least 2 more times. So we'll do the little zigzag to get back into position. 2 beads in the second row and then 2 beads in that outside row. Needle through all the beads in the loop. Try to wiggle around on you. Remember when you were reinforcing the rows and you wanted to make sure that you got all the beads, your needle going through all the beads? Well, it's the same way here on your loop, because if you don't, you're going to end up with some thread showing on the outside. back into the bracelet and those outside 4 beads. Then you'll turn around and reinforce that one more time and end off your thread. One of the things that drives all of us beaders crazy is when you get a knot in your thread. Most of the time when you get a knot in your thread, it's going to be a simple overhand knot. This is kind of what it looks like when it's loose. A lot of the times you're going to be able to kind of see it happening, and if you can catch it when you can still kind of see daylight through it, that is a total bonus, because you just want to stop whatever you're doing right there. Don't finish pulling your thread or anything. You want to take care of that knot before it gets any tighter and it's too hard to get out. So at this point, if you found a knot that's at this point where you can see so much daylight through there, really all you have to do is, I'll usually put my needle in there to make sure it doesn't close up all the way, and then just take my fingers and pull it out manually like that. But if you get it where it's all tightened down, now what do you do? Well, the best way to deal with this is actually to use a needle. You don't really know where the center of that knot is, so you just kind of want to start poking around and wiggling. And what will happen is eventually you're going to hit the right spot and it's going to start loosening up on you. Some beaders will use 2 needles to kind of separate it out, and that works great as long as you already have a little bit of daylight showing. Sometimes this can take quite a while to get that knot out, but it's worth it. You don't want, especially with square stitch, you are filling up the inside of those beads with a lot of thread, and you don't want to add a knot to the mixture. I'm starting to see a little bit of extra daylight here. Getting closer, believe it or not. Be persistent. It can take a while, but eventually you'll find that magic spot where all of a sudden you see the daylight. And then at that point, I've loosened it up enough that I can probably pick it out with my fingers. If not, using 2 needles will work too. You just want to make sure that you don't mess up and tighten it back up again. One of the other things that you can do is take the loose end of that thread and go ahead, once you see where it needs to go, poke it on up through the hole. And voila, no knot. None of us is perfect. So here's an example of where I was coming through this bead to attach this next little guy, and I completely missed the bead. I managed to just hook threads. So what I did is I took my needle off the working end of my thread, and I'm just going to pull that thread back out of there, get myself out of trouble, and start that stitch over. It's easiest if you pull off the needle, because if you try to back it out, you run the risk of splitting your thread and getting yourself into more trouble. So at this point, I've undone that stitch, and I'll put the needle back on the thread and start over again. There are several different things that you can do with this design to change it up a little bit. The way we have made it is where we include that size 3 bugle bead in this outside edge. But let's say you don't have those bugle beads available to you. What you may have is delicas. So in this sample, where we were putting a single bugle bead, you can put 2 delicas in that spot, and you can see that it really mimics the look of the original bracelet. In this variation, what we did was never increased or decreased. This is the exact same bracelet, just with the 4 inside colored delicas done all the length of the bracelet, which gives you a nice straight and not as wide bracelet. So that's another option for you. One of the things I absolutely adore about square stitch is how very strong it is. When you're working with it, you're not only circling around those beads several times, you're attaching the beads on from both sides, which makes it an exceptionally strong stitch. It also means that you can cut it apart and it will not fall apart. Say I made this bracelet and I want to give it to a friend and she has a smaller wrist than I do, so I need to make this bracelet shorter. Most of the time with seed bead work, if you want to make something shorter, you just simply have to remake the entire piece. But we have some magic here. We're going to work right in that center section where we had the 14 beads across. And I'm just going to pick a spot and I am literally just going to cut it into 2 pieces. And you would normally think that that whole thing would just fall apart, but it doesn't, because it's attached to the other beads on the other side, from the other side. So now that I've cut it apart, say I want to remove 3 rows. I'm just going to take those 3 rows and cut them right out of the bracelet. Boom, 3 rows gone. Now I can, using my square stitch, attach these 2 pieces back together again, and I just made my bracelet a 1/4 inch shorter. You can do the same thing if you want to lengthen your bracelet. Instead of cutting out a piece, you could just cut it in half and then attach a new thread and add more rows of the 14 across and attach it to the other side, and you've just managed to lengthen your bracelet. So that's it. You did it. You made your bracelet. I hope you had a really good time with it and that you're going to make many more in the future. If you do run into any trouble or have any questions, don't hesitate to email us at classes@beaducation.com, and I hope to see you again.